Okay, well, there's something that I want to correct, because my first statement said I left Hungary on November 23, 1956. Well, today Susan claimed that I was a Polish in her message. So, no, I'm not from Poland, yeah, but I'm from Hungary, and it's not too far from Poland. But anyhow, glad to be here. Okay, I'm not going back and give you the history of Hungary, but I will tell you a little bit about my family. My father was born in 1903, one of 4 children in a little small village on the western part of Hungary. His father was a sharecropper and could not make enough money to support his family, so in 1913 he came out to the United States, and he worked in a steel factory in the Pittsburgh area. Back after, at one time when my father came to visit me, him and I decided to see the landlord of his father and my grandfather, and he was still alive. And the first thing he said when I knocked on the door, he said, "Your grandfather did not leave any money with me." I said, "I'm not coming for the money." I guess it was customary when the Hungarian went back to the old country, left some money with the landlord. Or they put it in the pillow or under the pillow or whatever. But anyhow, so my grandfather worked here for about 25 years. And back in the latter part of the 30s, early 40s, he came back, and he was never able to come back into the United States thereafter. Okay, when my father was 11, about 1 year after my grandfather left and came to this country to work, my grandmother got hit by lightning and died right under the tree. Now, we all know better than that. When it's thundering and lightning, don't sit or stand under the tree. But anyhow, they didn't know any better. So it took a couple of years for my grandfather to come back to Hungary from the United States. But by the time the children were dispersed in the little village that they were living, and even though my grandfather remarried, my father and his siblings never moved in with the stepmother. So I don't know what happened after that. Anyhow, my father, I don't know what he done in the village, odds and ends, started to make a living. But at the age of 23, he left the village and went to Budapest and became a police recruit. So he was a policeman for the better part of his life. I guess in this country I would call him a river patrol or on the river police. That's what was his job, patrolling the Danube River. By 1935, he advanced to the point that he felt like that he can have a family. So he married my mother in January 1935. My mother was born in a village maybe 20 miles from my father's village in 1914. Her father, although didn't work in the United States, but he got killed in the Battle of World War I. So my grandmother had to raise his children, 2 sons, and my mother they had a very little farm, maybe 5 acres altogether, but he mostly was making a living out of selling milk and farm animals that he raised around the house. I'm one of the youngest ones around here, I learned, and I'll tell you why, because I was born in January 6, 1936. So I guess I'm a spring chick around here. Yeah, but at my first couple of years, my father was a policeman, and we lived in a gated police community. Life was very good there. My favorite pastime activity for my mother to take me to the zoo. And you listen to my wife Betty, she will tell you that, yeah, he crawled under the wire and get too close to the elephant got my hat. And that was the end of my hat. So I wasn't a very good visitor at the zoo. I spent much of my summer months at my grandmother's village, my mother's village, where she grew up, and I became a pretty good farm boy. My favorite times were when we were harvesting wheat. And we gathered it up in big bales and stacked it up on the wagons that was pulled by oxen. You know, my grandmother didn't have any horses, so they used oxen. But I did that, and back when it was time for me to go to school, it was still before communism set in, so I was enrolled into a private Catholic school. Well, it didn't last long. In 1944, things began to change. World War II, well, I was a little kid, it wasn't too difficult for me to live it through, but I got the feeling, they started deporting the Jewish family, and I was telling Betty, I didn't know if I ever told her that in my grandmother's village there was one Jewish family, and they came to deport them, and the father didn't want to get on the pickup truck, so they shot him right from the family. So that's not a very good experience to live through, But then the Jews were deported, and food shortages came in, and you American friends start bombing the hell of us. Every day, I could listen to the fire alarms, and the bombers came, and we could hear the bombs falling left and right. It got so bad that in 1944, the latter part of 44, we moved out of Budapest and moved on to my mother's village where she was born. And that was not the best place to be. They didn't have electricity in that little small village. They obviously didn't have no radios, but we had plenty of food to eat, so that was a good news. And by the way, I'm looking my outline over here. It makes it easier for me to talk. Otherwise, I start going off on a tangent and I never get to the end. So those of you who take Stretch and Flex with me, I always use my outline. I try to stick to my outline. But we had plenty of food. Okay, when started going into the latter part of 44, the Russians and the Germans started retrieving, and the Russians came right behind them. In my grandmother's village, we had a house where there were 2 bedrooms. We who lived there, we always crowded up in 1 bedroom, and the other bedroom was for guests. And so guess what? The Germans came in there and set up headquarters there, the German officers. And they treated me very well. I got chocolate candy from them. When the Russians came behind them, guess what? They took everything we ever had. And the Russians, go around from house to house, collect what they can put into their bag. And when their bag fills up, they just empty it out, so they make room for the new gathering. And when the Russians move through the village, then everybody takes what the Russians left inside of your house out on the sidewalk, and you go back and forth and collect what belongs to you. The other things that I remember, I learned the first word I learned in Russian, chasy. It's watch, wristwatch. The Russians were fascinated by wristwatches. The other thing, they were fascinated by barishnya, or woman. So guess what? My mother had to hide away from the Russians. I'm not going to tell you where she was hiding because you'll be horrified. Well, anyhow, So while I was down at the village, I attended the village school, and I was a privileged person there, obviously. I had the privilege of going out and getting sticks that for the principal, or there was a small school, the principal and the teacher. We had two classes in one room. One group of people were working on this chalkboard, other one working on the other one. So it wasn't much fun. But anyway, in March 1945, my father comes back home, but not my uncle. The last time my mother's brother, the uncle, he came back to see us in about October, November of 1944. Then he went back to the Russian front. So he never did come back home, so I guess he got killed on the Russian front. My father's job was, I told you he was a policeman patrolling the rivers. I guess you would call it a Coast Guard in Memphis. You know, his job was when the Germans were retrieving and pulling back, they took everything that was valuable they could get. They went to the museums, got original paintings out, other expensive items, you know. They put it all on the boat, and my father had to guide and assure the safety of that boat that was heading toward Vienna and toward Germany. So when the Russians came through, my father got caught in Austria. And he walked home from Austria all the way, so several hundred miles. But there was an interesting story. I got my wedding band over here. The Russians saw my father's wedding band on his finger, and he wanted to get the wedding band. Well, I can pull mine out. It's loose. But my father couldn't get it off. So guess what? He was reaching for his pocket knife. So you know what would have happened. But the lady whose house my father was confronted by the Russians yelled out, "Germans, Germans," pointing out to the back of the wooded area. So the Russians started running after the Germans, and guess what? He put my father into a safe place. But anyhow, my father come home in March 1945. Soon after that, we moved back from the village of my mother to Budapest. Total devastation, you know, but our apartment was saved. You know, didn't drop any bomb on our apartment. So that was there. The bridges and the railroad tracks going right behind it, you know, there was a lot of damage there. We had food shortages, heating fuel shortages. So guess what was my job? When the trains start running again on the tracks, and by the way, you were generous enough, you brought in some American steam engine locomotives, I call them, steam engines, you know, and they had a little tender behind it and carrying the coal. So it was my job when the train go by to get up to the tracks and collect all the coal I could with a bucket so we can heat our apartment for the rest of the day and that night. Okay. It's, you know, runaway inflation came on, you know, right after 1945. And, you know, it was so bad that when you went to a market, if you had a peach trees at home, you grow peaches, you sell it on the market, you better go in and buy something for your money right away. Otherwise, what you get for 10 pounds of peaches is not going to buy anything, not even an egg. So inflation was pretty bad. The Hungarian government started nationalizing companies, factories, and in the farm area, I call it collectivization. They made collective farming out of the individual small farmers. Everybody joined the co-op, I guess you would call it, and everybody worked together, and they shared the profit equally in the end. I remember I was a Boy Scout. To begin with, you know, they closed the Boy Scout, they were outlawed. In 1948, finally came in the one-party system. We only had a Communist Party. So when you went to vote, You could only vote against it or for the Communist Party. And the way you made it distinguished, if you voted for the Communist Party, when they gave you the ballot sheet, you put it in the drop box. If you don't want to vote for the Communist Party, you throw it in the trash can. And guess what? That's the end of you. Yeah, you're not going to be voting against if you ever dare do that. And I'm not joking. That's unfortunate. That's the way it worked. In 1949 is when Hungary attempted to get away from the Soviet bloc, like Yugoslavia. You remember the name Tito in Yugoslavia? He broke away and had his own own version of communism. Well, Hungary tried that, but the gentleman who headed up, Laszlo Rajk, he was tried, convicted, and executed for treason. Well, unfortunately, my father had his little hands in it. Him and his police chief supported that movement. So my father was arrested, and we got evicted from our government-provided quarters. I told you we lived in a gated police community. But fortunately, my father was let go. He came back. By that time, they moved all our furnishing and all of our personal belongings out from the apartment out to the courtyard. So guess what? We were out there in the open sky, spending the night on a little baby bed, couch, whatever. And they were supposed to deport us. Somewhere on the Russian border, some potato farm. But guess what? They never came. That's one of the reasons I was able to make it over here to the village. They never did come. And at some point of time later on, my father was able to get a 360 square foot apartment. My village apartment is 1,100 square foot over here. Most of you got more than that. Just think about it, 1/3 of what you and I have. And my family lived in the 360 square foot apartment. Initially, my mother and father, 2 brothers, and guess what, in 1950, here it comes, not the worst time, another brother, my younger brother. Okay, well, went on, I graduated from the 8th grade. Unfortunately, I couldn't go to public high school because of what my father did before and during and after the war. That was the question, not how smart you are. What did your father did before and during and after the war? So I was punished because of my father's doings. Later on, I had my own problems. But anyhow, I was very fortunate that was the year when the communist government let the Catholic Church reopen a couple of schools. And that was a boys' high school. And guess what? I was a shoo-in. My father was able to get me in because I was not allowed to go to public school. So, and in 1953, I don't know how much you remember your history, but Stalin died. So that was giving a hope to everybody, but things didn't get much better. In 1954, after I finished the private high school, guess what? I wasn't accepted into a university because of what my father did before and during and after the war, and because I went to a Catholic parochial school. So now, I was guilty as well. Well, anyhow, it went on like that. And so what I done at that point, during the summer months, I continued my summer job. I was working, going out to the fruit orchards in the country and going with a pickup truck. And it was my job to load up the pickup truck and bring it to the city, to the market, while the driver was sleeping while I was loading, then I was sleeping while he was driving. So we worked it out pretty good. I continued my summer job, and then later on, one of my high school buddies who went to the same parochial school, and by the way, he just went through this country from Australia. He was on the way back to Florida. He got 2 homes, Florida and Australia. His parents opened up a candy making operation in the basement of an apartment house. When the government shut down all private businesses, they lost that business. But now they were able to open up a little candy making shop in the basement of an apartment house. So I worked with them, and they gave me a job. Okay, the economy is actually getting worse. Well, I had a job and we had something to eat. 1956 come around. Well, that turned out to be a turning point in my life. And on June 29, you may remember, the Soviet imposed the martial law in Poland. And Susan thinks I'm from Poland. No. For the anti-communist revolt they had. So imposed martial law there. Okay, right about that time, I received my diploma in bakery and candy making. And that came handy later on for me. Now, at this time, when I applied for a university and the third go-around, because I was a member of the working class, I was based on the fact that I am now a graduate baker and a candy maker. So guess what? I was admitted to 2 different universities. I chose the Budapest Technical University. And if you remember your history, on October 22nd of 1956, that is the university that started the uprising in Hungary. And I was involved in that one. We came up, we drafted some demands and later on submitted to the government. And the typical thing we ask, Russians go home, election by secret ballot instead of the one-party system that we followed. We wanted a new government established under a civic leader by Imre Nagy, freedom of expression, and we wanted the Stalin statue to come down. He was dead now. We don't want him to be a symbol in the public parks. Anyhow, October 23rd comes around, and that is the date where my university started the uprising. My principal role was to go around from factories to factories and talk to the workers during their lunch breaks to come and support the university movement that we started. And I'll tell you what, that was a frightening experience because I was openly soliciting help to join the rebellion against the communist government. But I was constantly looking the door here and door there and over here, see when somebody's going to come in and haul me off, but it never happened. Okay, but pretty soon the students were joined by the working class, and within a couple of days we had about 200,000 people marching in Budapest. And I was part of the march. When from Parliament we went to the radio station, and I wanted to go in and read the same points that I had in our demands to the government. And guess what? The policeman there was waiting and started shooting us. So I didn't get shot. Very lucky, fortunate, I'm here. Okay, on October 23rd, when it started, for a couple of days, things going pretty busy. And a couple of days later, the Russian tanks, the Soviet tank, opened fires on an unarmed protesters, so that didn't last too long. They asked the Hungarian armored division with tanks to join the Soviet bloc. But guess what? The head of that armored division decided he'd rather join the uprising, the rebels, join the rebellion. So now we had a military leader heading up our revolution in Hungary for the rest of the way. And pretty soon the revolution spread through the country. And before it was all over, we had a new government was sworn in by the same gentleman who was in our demands. The Hungarian Secret Service was disbanded temporarily. And soon after that, we were asking the United Nations to go ahead and protect our independence from the Russians, but we didn't get much help. And you may remember the state of Israel invaded Egypt on October 29, and the Suez Canal crisis got worse. And in spite of the fact that Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America was telling us for years, start a revolution against the communist regime and we'll be there to help you, to carry you the rest of the way. Well, this good old country of mine over here now got too busy on defending their rights in the Suez Canal, and nobody was worried about Hungary. So anyhow, it goes on like that, and here comes November 4th. And in case you never heard it before, in Hungary and in Europe, we celebrate name days as well as birthdays. And November 4th is the name day of Charles Bornemisza, the Catholic leader. And because your name day is on the calendar, that every published calendar, everybody knows when you got a birthday. And everybody gonna come and greet you on your birthday. And my father had the same name, I had the same name, so obviously that used to be, my mother had to start cooking meals the day before because he had to be prepared to feed everybody, comes and wish us happy name day. On the 4th of November, Soviet troops rolled into Budapest to crush the revolution with 1,000 tanks, 1,000 tanks. Well, at that point, I gave up. And guess what? I went back home. I spent the previous 2 weeks, as part of the revolution, going here to here, there, I went back home. I just couldn't see fighting the Russian tanks, with small arms or your bare hands. You remember the most effective weapon against the Russian tanks was the Molotov cocktail. It's a bottle of gasoline that you put a little cloth in there, light it, and throw it into the tank. And when the gasoline, the bottle breaks, the fire spread all over on the tank. And the Russian soldiers are going to start coming out of the tank. But prior to that, and there's a good reason why I'm listing that, I did go out and I told you solicited the factory workers' support. I participated in demonstration. I distributed arms to civilians to take up the fight. And I took up battle positions and helped to set up barricades to keep the Russian tanks from coming across the streets. But I do not recall killing anybody, not a Russian, not anybody. Comes about a week later, the Soviet claimed total victory over the Hungarian freedom fighters. So that's when the mass exodus begun of Hungarians to Austria. Of course, that didn't last too long before the Hungarian military and the Soviet military start closing down the Austrian border. They start picking up university students, my fellow students, for their participation in starting up the revolution. I got some statistics here. The casualties during the revolution: 722 Russians were killed, 2,500 Hungarians. Wounded Russians, 1,250, but 13,000 Hungarians get wounded during the fight. November, getting down to toward the end, November 4th, 20th, is when some of my friends, after they knew what my involvement was in the revolution, starting it up, and my participation in the revolt, encouraged me to try to get out to Austria before they closed the borders down. And as it turned out, a good thing I did, because my mother told me that 4 days after they walked away from their home, our little 260 square foot apartment, 360 square foot apartment, the authorities were looking for me. And it just so happened, I don't know if you ever made strudel in your life, but you remember you got to stretch a little dough, paper thin, on a white tablecloth table. And that's what my mother was doing. And she had a tablecloth hanging almost down to the floor and making strudel. And they keep asking, "But where is your son, Mrs. Stilley?" "I don't know." "Well, did he get killed during the revolution?" "I don't know." "Did he escape the country? Did he go to Austria?" "I don't know." My mother finally gets so frustrated, she lifted up the tablecloth, and there was my 4-year younger brother doing homework under that little table, not much bigger than what, little small dining room table. That was my study table, that was the dining room table, that's what everything we had. Anyhow, at that point, the authorities just walked away from home and didn't ask any more questions from my mom. November 21st rolled around. Oh, I'm doing good. I'll pick up speed. November 21st rolled around, and I walk away from home. Just think about it. Not knowing whether you're going to make it to Austria or not, whether you get killed before you get over the border, or what's your life going to be. It was not imaginable to me to ever see my family again once I walked away from them. So guess what? I didn't say goodbye. Didn't say goodbye to my mom and dad. I waited until they went to work. Took my little youngest brother with them to the kindergarten, and my 4-year younger brother was still asleep. I walked away from that place. Anyhow, I started heading toward going to the west, and first thing I did, I got on a streetcar and took a streetcar to the end of Budapest, still heading west. Then I started walking down the road hoping somebody's going to pick me up in a pickup truck. So he did. There was a farmer's trailer coming by. They let me get on the trailer, and they took me a little bit longer. Then they turn off to the farm. I get off the trailer, keep walking again. And guess what? At that point, I run into a Russian truck with Russian soldiers on that truck. Well, my Russian was pretty good back those days because I had 4 years of Russian. This came to my advantage. I started talking to them and asked them what direction they're going, and they told me they're heading west. I said, "Can I join you all? Can I get on the truck with you?" They said, yeah. So anyhow, I traveled on the Russian truck for a while, and the Russians took me toward the Austrian border. How little they knew what I was doing. Later on, I get off the Russian truck and get on the train. and take a train, still going west. And at some point in time, we had to change trains. And when I was changing the train, I thought I got smart. Instead of getting out on the right side, I was getting off the train on the left side, on the inside, between the tracks. Guess what? They were waiting for me. So they asked me, what am I doing over here, so far away from Budapest? I said, I'm trying to get to my grandmother's village. And I knew that was about 20 miles south from where I was at that point. Okay. They made sure that I'd be heading south, not west toward the border. So I started walking. Night come around, well, I get tired of walking. I knock on somebody's door in the farming community. They let me in. They fed me supper. Because I had to tell them the story, what was happening in Budapest with the revolution. Because back those days in the villages, there's still no phones. Some of them had electricity, but no radios, so they didn't know what was happening. So for my telling them, bringing them up to date what's happening in the revolution, they fed me, and they put me up for the night. I slept in a barn, and that was good. Next morning, there were more people waiting for me when I got up. For breakfast, I had to talk some more, bring them up to date. Next thing I know, I had to leave, and I started heading toward my grandmother's village. I finally get there about 6 o'clock at night. It was getting dark. There was my uncle feeding the cows, and I walk up to my grandmother and tell her who I am. She was getting old. She couldn't see good. I said, no, you cannot be Charles, my grandson. He lives in Budapest. Okay, well, so what do you say? Anyhow, pretty soon there's some other villagers coming over there to talk to me. And at that time, I was still about 100 miles from the Austrian border. So next day, I catch the train heading toward the Austrian border. Instead of going into the border town, I get off about the last stop before the border town. And some other people did the same. And we start heading west. Pretty soon, what we thought there was a border. I got to go in and take a sip of water because my throat is drying out. May I have some, please? I'm not used to talking. I talk a lot, but I'm not used to talking an hour. Anyhow, make long story short, I started going, and pretty soon, about 3 or 4 other people joined me, heading toward the border. We had a farmer help us to take us part of the way. And then we saw some lights ahead of us, and he said, that's about where the Austrian border is. I'm not going with you any further, but you go that way. So guess what? I had some other people over there with me, with some children, and I volunteered to find out what's there where that light is. So I literally crawled on my belly for the rest of the way until I get close enough. I realized they were not speaking Hungarian, they were not speaking Russian. I didn't speak any German, but they had to be Austrians. So what I do, I get up, go over there, talk to them. They welcome me. There were some Hungarian interpreters there. There was the Austrian border guard and the Austrian Red Cross waiting for escapees. So at that point, I just yelled to everybody behind me and said, come on, we're in the right place. Anyhow, so I was in Austria, and it was on November the 24th when I got into Austria. And the first night, they came over there, and they took us with a little carrier truck small truck, to the nearest town, and we spent the first night in a schoolhouse sleeping on straw mattresses. But hey, that was it. It was freedom at last. So that was the most comfortable bed I ever slept in. From there, next day, and it was Sunday, the next day, they moved us on to another town outside of Vienna. And we were even given the opportunity to go to church. And guess what? All of us, whether we went to church in Hungary under the communist years or not, we all went to church, and thank God for getting us out of the communist country. And that night, we slept on the cot, not on the mattress, not on the straw mattress on the floor. Okay, I'm going to move on. When we were in Vienna, outskirts of Vienna on a train, they asked us where would anybody like to go. And I indicated that I want to go to Switzerland because I was a candy maker and a baker, and my master told me, if you ever get out, go to Switzerland. They make real fine candy over there. So guess what? Next day, I was on the bus heading towards Switzerland. But because of me crawling around on the wet ground, I still had the wet clothes on. A couple of days later, I caught cold. And when we get to Linz, Austria, the nurse on the bus decided to put me in the hospital. So a couple of days later, I was well enough. Where they're going, the bus is long gone. By the time I find out that the quota to go to Switzerland, it was filled up already. You can't go there anymore. So they put me in there outside of Linz, Austria. There was a World War II concentration camp. And that's where they were gathering up all the Hungarian refugees. Hey, that was good. We got food, we stayed in the barracks, typical wooden barracks, just like you had in, later on I find out it was Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, when they drafted me into the American Army. That's the kind of barracks we had there. But, so that's where we stayed, and while I was there, I had the opportunity to declare that I want to go to the United States. And the reason for that is because while I was in Linz, Austria, before I got into the concentration camp, I met a lady whose brother was a professor of mathematics at Dartmouth University, who graduated from the same parochial high school I did. And she was telling that story to her brother, and the brother said, if that fellow Tilly can prove it to you that he indeed graduated from the same parochial high school I did, I have a scholarship for him, put him on the plane. Guess what? I had 2 pieces of paper in my wet clothes. One was my bakery diploma, candy making diploma, and my high school graduation diploma. And I still have it here in the safe. Anyhow, so before I knew that, I was on the way to Munich, Germany, where I was put on the plane and headed to the United States, to Dartmouth College. And I was in the Christmas season came around, while all that was happening. And I remember I had my Christmas day and it was in New Jersey, in the military base. That's where they were gathering all the Hungarian refugees instead of everybody going up to New York, to the Eiffel Tower or whatever. But it was sad. That was my first Christmas without my family. And next thing I know, here comes my birthday, January 4th, my birthday. And that's the first birthday I celebrated without my family. But it's kind of sad. I was happy, but then again, there were some sad times. Well, make long story short, pretty soon after that, it was time for me to head to the United States. They put me on the plane, and we landed in Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, in a military base. And that's where I was processed in as a refugee to the United States. Well, one of the things they asked me is, what is your name? I said, Tilly Caroy. Ah, Caroy, that's Charles. So we're going to call you Charles from now on instead of Caroy. You might remember the Polish Pope. His name was Karoli. It's Caroy, pronounced Caroy. Anyhow, I said, what is your last name? I said, Tilly. I used to spell it T-I-L-I. They wrote it down, T-I-L-L-Y. So my new name became from Tilly Caroy, I became Charles Tilly. So that's how fast. I didn't have to go, no court costs, no nothing, no witnesses. Okay, well, I was still up there. I'm just going to move on, and from there, I had an opportunity to go to an English language training program. There was a college, little small town, Bard College in upstate New York. And some of you may remember, there's only about 200-300 students there. That was a university where the students did academic learning for a while, and then they went practice their work. And while they were away on their work duty, we stayed there, and we had about a couple of hundred Hungarians, 10 American students, and 2 language professors from the Army's language school who were trying to teach us English. Well, they all learned Hungarian, and I didn't learn much English. I can contest to that, and later on, Betty will tell you he was telling the truth. Okay. But while I was in there, in that language training place, I had an opportunity to put my name in for any other scholarship that I may want to consider. And back at that time, there was a lot of universities that were offering scholarships to Hungarian refugees. So guess what? Before too long, I got an offer to come to the University of Mississippi, along with a fellow by the name of John Adler. So I decided to take that. In Dartmouth, I would have to work for the math professors, working on the Dartmouth time-sharing system. I would have to stay in the dorm. I would have to work in the dorm kitchen or restaurant to wash dishes. Guess what? Ole Miss sounded better. Well, okay, so I called my sponsor up at Dartmouth and explained to him that I changed my mind. I'm not coming to Dartmouth. I'm going to Ole Miss. He tried to discourage me the hardest he could. He told me that on the South, among other people, they hate foreigners. Well, I didn't listen to him. And as it turned out, he didn't hate foreigners, because Betty is from Olive Branch, Mississippi, and her father was a Southerner, and he let me marry his daughter. So they did not discriminate against Hungarians. Okay, well, I got to get on. Next thing I know, it's time to go on and head to Ole Miss. Well, in New York, I was put on the plane along with this other Hungarian, John. We're giving tickets, and we're going to be giving $5 food money, buy something to eat on the way. It was going to be a 24-hour train ride. Well, it appeared that they put us on the wrong train. Our ticket called for going to Memphis to Cincinnati and not to Washington, D.C. But the conductor explained to John. John had some English in Hungary, so he could communicate, basically. And he was explaining that you can go, when you get into D.C., change your train ticket. They go to via Chattanooga to Memphis. Well, we got in, but they asked for extra money. So that's when our food money went, the $5 each. So we didn't have any money the rest of the way for a 24 hours. But make long story short, in spite of our concern, was anybody going to know that we're on the wrong train? Who is going to meet us in Memphis? When we get to Memphis, the university delegation was waiting right there. And you may have seen a picture around, I put a couple of pictures out there, that John and I getting off the train. And that picture appeared in the Memphis Press Seminar. And you remember that paper was here beside the Commercial Appeal back those days. And the headline was, Hungarian rebel becomes an Ole Miss rebel. Well, anyhow, we made it. And we had I didn't speak a word of English. John had some English. But my survivor was that the university delegation, there was a naval ROTC officer whose family, who was a second generation Hungarian from Louisiana. So he did my translating for time to come. Well, after we arrived, they fed us to the Embers restaurant. We told them, we said, we didn't have any money to eat. So can you take us out to eat before we head to Ole Miss? So they took us to the Embers restaurant. That was the finest steakhouse back those days in Memphis. Some of you who live here know that. It's down at Park Avenue and Getwell, right in the corner. Anyhow, we got headed down south to our final destination. And this is where I ended my talk last time. And when some of you convinced Susan that they ought to put me back up here and talk to you again. So now I'd like to take the rest of my 10 minutes, just talk a little bit about what happened after we got here. Okay, well, and by the way, there's part 2 in my outline called Living in the Land of Opportunity. Living in the Land of Opportunity, because this is what I call. Anybody can make it if I made it. And they didn't do bad if I'm over here at the village of Germantown, because they made sure I got enough money. You don't have to feed me the rest of my life. But during the first year at the university, my best friend was my pocket-sized Hungarian English dictionary. I didn't speak a word of English. When I arrived to Ole Miss and we were introduced to the student body in the auditorium, only thing I could say, thank you. That's the only word I knew. So my scholarship was $5,000, unlimited, no restrictions. That was basically to cover 4 years of education. The university covered my tuition, medical expenses, laundry, and dormitory room expenses. That was for your incidental expenses, personal expenses. So I drew $100 a month. When I got to the point that my $100 wasn't enough, guess what? I had to get a part-time job to make up the difference. So I had my first part-time job was working for I guess you call it an archaeologist. He was in the university in the archaeological department, and I worked for him in the basement of the Lyceum building, but his office was reconstructing pottery that he brought back from Mexico, and was trying to reconstruct it, what it should have looked like. I was a good draftsman. I was always good in my hands. So that was my part-time job. That part-time job later on took me down to Mexico, went on an archaeological expedition. But in spite of my summer work, one of my other summer jobs was in Jackson, Mississippi. 2 years, in the second year after I spent 2 years at Ole Miss. By that time, I knew about segregation integration very much. In the restaurant in Oxford, there was a restaurant for blacks, restaurant for whites. Bathrooms, the same way. Black and white couldn't go into the same bathroom. But I never knew that the buses were segregated. In Jackson, Mississippi, I lived in a boarding house near the Capitol, and I was riding the bus to and from work in North Jackson. And one day I get on the bus. I want to sit down. I had something, I want to do some paperwork. And the only seat I saw is way in the back of the bus. So I started elbowing my way through the folks in the front part of the bus. And they were telling me, shouting at me, throwing insults at me, but I didn't know what they were saying. My English wasn't good enough to understand. Well, before too long, two healthy American people come in the backyard on the back seat, grabbed me by my arm, and threw me off the back door. The next stop, I landed on the sidewalk with my butt. Okay, now I get to work late, obviously, so I'm trying to explain with my broken English to my boss what happened to me. He said, Charlie, on the way home, look for this sign, colored. It's in there about halfway right around the back door. Only colored folks, black people can sit in the back behind that. I didn't know. Well, I learned the hard way. You know, I learned other things the hard way. Nonetheless, I finished my college education, and I don't know if I forgot to tell you that when I went to Ole Miss, I chose to be civil engineering. I want to major in civil engineering. I was always good in math, so obviously there was a mathematical science, and I was in engineering school in Hungary for a short while before the revolution broke out, and I had to walk away from that school. But anyhow, so I went to engineering school. I finished in 3.5 years. And we got 160 semester hours. Now, how did I get up to 160 semester hours in 3.5 years? Besides, on the weekends, while everybody party around, I didn't have my money, I didn't have a car. I went to the engineering school library and studied over there. But I also got credit for some math. In Hungary, I had almost all the math courses in high school, in the parochial high school I went to, that you teach in engineering school in this country in the freshman and the sophomore year. So they told me if you pass differential calculus, we give you credit for all the other math courses before that lead up to it. So I got about 30, 40 free credit hours. But 160 semester hours was still good. While everybody was partying around, I studied in the library, but I made it. Okay, I got to tell you about my first summer job. Was in Oxford, Mississippi, while I was going to school, working for Chambers Manufacturing Company. We were making kitchen appliances. I was assembling kitchen appliances. First year, second year, after 2 years at Ole Miss. Hey, didn't take any language. Anybody can learn. But that's when I heard Elvis Presley's name mentioned first time. Well, as it turned out, all the lady employees work with me in the assembly plant start crying when Elvis's name was mentioned. Well, it turned out that's when Elvis's mother died. And everybody broke out crying, all the ladies. Okay, before I go into too much longer, I got to recognize Betty. I met Betty on before the first year, during my first year at Oxford. And she was my interpreter, She guided me to learn the everyday life in America. It's just, we grew together so much that in 1960 we got married. And there she is. We've been married ever since. So that's good. And she takes care of me now. She's much healthier than I am. But anyhow, that chair is still keeping me. My leg is going a little bit numb, but that's okay. Don't worry about it. I'll finish. She helped me with the English language and adjusting to the life in America. That's what I had over here. Okay, so during the summer of 1959 is when I went to Mexico on that archaeological expedition. As is interesting, you might say. First of all, the Mexicans would not let me in without any security payment. I had to deposit $3,000, cash dollars, to the Austrian border. Not the Austrian, but the Mexican border before they let me in. Because I was still a Hungarian citizen. By that, they still considered me a communist agent. So I had to put the money down so they can round me up, find me somewhere for $3,000. When I was on the way back, I'll go to the airport, try to get my money back. They said, no, you get it back tomorrow when you leave. Well, I didn't get my money until I was on the plane. The uniformed guard walked up on the plane with me, and everybody was panicked because they thought I was a jailbird being transported back to the United States. But when he started counting down $3,000 in $20 bills to me, everybody was relieved. So I didn't get my money back until the guard left and the plane took off. So there's no way I could stay in Mexico with my money in my pocket. Well, it's interesting. Oh, and going on, you know, when I graduated, that was the time when we were getting into building the interstate highway system. And civil engineers were looked after. I could name my job. So I first started working in Jackson, Mississippi for a company, the same company I worked one summer months, one summer. But then they moved me up to Rochester, Pennsylvania, where the headquarters was. I guess I was good to be moved up to headquarters. But we didn't like it up there. So we moved to Washington, D.C. There my job was to design the limited access highway between the National Airport and the Capitol. If you ever went to the Capitol from National Airport, you know what you drove on my thing. It went on like that. We were living in Washington, D.C. when President Kennedy made the announcement that we will beat the Russians to the moon. We will be first to land on the moon. Guess what? After President Kennedy died, and we went to see his body, said farewell to him on the Capitol, I got a job in Huntsville, Alabama. And in Huntsville, I worked on the Saturn V rocket. That's the rocket that took our people to the moon. And my job was very limited. I worked on the Stage 1 fuel tank. That fuel tank was I designed it and tested it, made sure it will withstand the pressure of all the liquid in it. Some 300,000 gallons of liquid fluid in there, combustible. But anyhow, it worked. So I contributed my share to getting us to the moon. And you see the Apollo movies lately, you saw my rocket. And we were in Huntsville, Alabama, when I did this project. This is where our daughter Christina came to see us, sitting over there. Anyhow, I had many other jobs in the United States. I did levee design for the U.S. Army Engineers. Then ultimately came back to Memphis because we thought we need to be near to Betty's family. Betty's father was seriously ill. So we moved back to Memphis. I got a pretty good job out in Millington from the Navy as a civilian employee. I worked with educational psychologists and developed a computer-managed instructional system where you could move in your own speed through the learning material. Individualized instruction instead of the traditional lockstep method that we follow every place else when we go to school. So I done so good in that job. I saved so much money for the Navy. You know, when you let everybody go through their own speed, the average person will graduate faster. And when you go to University of Mississippi or Memphis State, you pay your tuition. They don't care how long you're going to stay, how long it's going to take you to get your degree. In Millington, when we try to put students through, recruits through military training, it was important. Next thing I know, the Navy comptroller hired me to develop a standard financial management system on large mainframe computers. Had a chance to travel around the world, visited every Navy installation around the world to put a mainframe computer there that will feed management information up to Washington to the Navy comptroller. Anyhow, make a long story short, I had a pretty good career. So every corner on this country, every corner of the world, I survived it, and I retired in 1995. And Betty and I moved in here about 6-7 years ago, so we've been enjoying the village life over here ever since. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to tell my story again. I would say you are very good listeners, and we met a lot of good friends, and thank you. Good to see all my friends putting up with me for 60 minutes, 70 minutes. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Go in peace.